we are redoing the Eclipse public license, which is the basic license that every, not every, but most projects the Eclipse Foundation uses. And we have not updated the EPL since the creation of the Eclipse Foundation 13 years ago. And as we get into this, you'll see the motivations for why it's time to change. But just a brief history on the EPL version 1. It was based on its predecessor, the Common Public License, which was written circa 2001. That was an IBM license. The Eclipse license was approved back in 2003, just briefly before the creation of the Eclipse Foundation. It was part of the discussions that led to the Eclipse Foundation, but it's basically the same as the license that was drafted in 2001. There's only really two changes, which was it slightly narrowed, no, not slightly, it narrowed the scope of patent termination in the event of a patent lawsuit, and changed the license steward from IBM to the Eclipse Foundation. And so the license says, so basically the EPL license as we have it today dates back to about 2001. So some of the goals and motivations for EPL v2. So one is the EPL version 1 uses the word modules. We've had some feedback that that's a little bit nebulous and confusing, so we're going to change that to the more concrete files. Choice of law has been something that something we've run into numerous times. The EPL version 1 says that the choice of law is New York State, and this has been an issue that's come up a number of times over the years, especially with the number of companies and projects that we have in Europe. Interpreting the license with a US-centric interpretation was viewed as problematic by some. And it's actually, doing this means that we're going to have to add some definitions, because by choosing a specific legal framework, you can avoid some certain definitions, but certainly in this case, we need to define derivative work. And one other thing I'd like to point out on the choice of law is that the EPL is one of the top 10 licenses, open source licenses, as we regularly see from the Black Duck surveys that they do. So it's one of the top 10 licenses in open source. It is the only one in the top 10 that actually stipulates a choice of law. So the Apache license, the Mozilla license, the GNU licenses, none of those other licenses actually specify a choice of law. So we've actually always been a bit of an outlier in there. Some modernization items. So we want to make sure that the EPL is clear for use with scripting languages where the source code and the executable code are one and the same. We want to be a little bit clearer that it's okay to point to the Eclipse Foundation or some other open source repository as where you can find the source code. The EPL version 1 says that you have to copy all of the source code and make it available yourself if you want to distribute EPL code. And frankly, that may have been okay in 2001, but it's unnecessary copying as far as we're concerned. Right, we want to make sure that it's explicit that subclassing EPL code does not create a derivative work, and just by subclassing, you don't have to EPL your product, for example. And clean up some stuff about notices. And then one of the big ones is GPL compatibility. So what we want to do there is, for projects that want to be GPL compatible, they can choose to do so when the project is starting up. And then there's some miscellaneous cleanup that we'll talk about in a second. But what did not change? So at least in the current draft, there are like the copyright license, the patent license, patent termination, commercial distribution. These are sort of the topics that lawyers lawyers really focus in on. They are unchanged. We had a couple of phone calls this morning. We might add one phrase to the copyright license, but that's still hasn't been confirmed. But fundamentally and effectively, those major components of the license remain unchanged. So who's been working on this? So we have an IP advisory committee of the board of directors, and so the individuals listed there are the members of that committee and have been doing most of the heavy lifting on these drafts. There is a public discussion on EPL Discuss at eclipse.org, and I highly encourage folks to join in on that. And that's also where you find out about where the public conference calls are. We had a call this morning. We had a call last week. We'll have a couple more later in April or early May. But we've been getting some really, really excellent feedback on the drafts from those public conference calls. So just getting into a little more detail. So file versus module. File is clearly one as the term of art, and it's more concrete and better understood. I'd also point out that the Eclipse Contributor Agreement and its predecessor, the CLA, Eclipse Contributor Agreement ties in the developer contribution, or certificate of origin, the developer certificate of origin from the Linux Foundation, which is very, very widely known and understood in the open source community. It refers to file as well, so this helps make the links a little bit more consistent between the two. Choice of law I've already talked about. This has necessitated the addition of a number of definitions, which I think actually helps clarify the intent and scope of the Eclipse public license. Scripting languages, we added some definitions for source code and executable code, and we've added some terms to make it clear that where source is the same as executable, that you can distribute that source code under another license, just as you could distribute binaries for Java under another license. As I talked earlier, remove the requirement that source code has to be copied by the distributor. We're perfectly happy to have distributors point back to the repositories at Eclipse Foundation as the place to find the source code for what they're distributing. Notices, this is stuff only lawyers can love, but we basically added some requirements around the notices that cannot be removed or altered, and removed a sentence that was in the first that will just move this into a matter of Eclipse Foundation policy rather than a license obligation. Just to talk a little bit about GPL compatibility and particularly the motivation. So we've actually over the last couple of years in areas like IoT started to get a bunch of projects that are EPL version 1 plus the BSD. We use a variant of the BSD called the Eclipse Distribution License. And the reason given for a lot of these projects to use the BSD is because they need to be compatible with GPL license projects because of the domain that they live in. So, in IoT land, you often have to have drivers that work with Linux, for example. The disadvantage to doing this is it loses the copyleft nature of the EPL, which means that contributions do not have to come back to the community. And people, in fact, can distribute changes without even making the source code available anywhere. And so because Foundation and the Eclipse community and the Eclipse public license are all copyleft oriented, and we would like to figure out a way to be GPL compatible without losing the copyleft nature. It's almost counterintuitive that that the path to GPL compatibility is to give up on copyleft. So that's the motivation for doing this. But it's important. And so the way that we're going to do this is basically copying the way that the Mozilla Public License 2.0 did this a few years ago. But it is important to note that you are not GPL compatible by default. So none of the existing projects that are using EPL 1.0 or by default, any new projects. By default, they are not GPL compatible. The only way to become GPL compatible is to add notices to the code when you first start a new project, and that's when you can do this. But so as we move forward, once this license is approved, you'll be able to start a new project doing it this way. Again, a couple of clean up things and miscellaneous. There's a few things that we are getting rid of. We also added, and to the extent permitted by applicable law, to the warranty and liability, limitation of liability sections. And that was done specifically because in certain jurisdictions, such as Germany, you cannot say that you have no warranties and no liability. That's just clarifying that so that we don't have those, the rest of those sections stricken by a court. So that's it for EPL version 2. Just want to remind everybody that this is a big deal. So if you're listening in either live or recorded and you are working for a company that is a part of the Eclipse ecosystem, I would highly encourage you to bring this to the attention of your legal colleagues and encourage them to join in on EPL Discuss, or send me an email if they have any questions. We obviously want to get this right, but we think that this is a long overdue overhaul of the basic legal framework. And I firmly believe that the Eclipse Public License version 2 is going to be a better license than what we have today.